When Lincoln Met Euclid by Gary Taylor. That's me. Chapter 1. So, when did they meet? I mean, ... Abraham Lincoln is my favorite hero. I have other heroes, but he is definitely my favorite. First of all, he was a good man. By that, I mean he was someone who cared deeply about his fellow human beings. All of them. Everything I've read about him and by him makes me believe this, and I've read a lot. Secondly, I think that he decided to become smart, to become intelligent. Many might say he was born that way, and I must admit I can't prove them wrong in that, but my current belief is that it was more of a decision. Part of this book will give my reasons for thinking this. It's not necessarily the main point of the book, but then again it might be. And one more thing about Lincoln, a third thing. He had a great sense of humor. So Lincoln is my favorite hero, and let me add that for essentially the same reasons, Albert Einstein is probably my second favorite. And after that, I really can't rank them. As for Euclid, I have never really thought of him as a hero, primarily because I know almost nothing about him. No one knows much about him. There's very little biographical information on him, and none of it very reliable. I don't know whether he cared about his fellow humans, and I don't know if he had a sense of humor. But perhaps he is a hero in a different way. All we really know of him is he left a masterpiece, a book that he wrote about 2,300 years ago. It's known as Euclid's Elements, and it is technically 13 small books on mathematics, but they are usually published together as a single volume that makes it more like an average-sized book with 13 chapters. The first 6 of these books, or chapters, deal specifically with geometry, and sometimes they are published without the other 7. Lincoln often referred to the 6 books of Euclid, so his own copy was probably of this smaller publication that was strictly geometry. So when did Lincoln meet Euclid? Or how did Lincoln meet Euclid, since their lives were separated by approximately 2,100 years? I believe, after coming up with the title of this book, that the title is a tribute to the power of written language. Lincoln met Euclid when he read Euclid's Elements. Lincoln met Euclid through the written word. Of course, this is the same way that we know Lincoln, and the same way we know Euclid for that matter. I used to take that for granted, but in recent years I am profoundly affected by the small miracle of having access to the thoughts of people from the past, especially great people from the past. Through the power of the written word, I feel like I know Lincoln very well. In fact, better than I know many people that I've actually met in person, because I've had access to, or perhaps more accurately, a glimpse into his own thoughts and emotions and beliefs through his writing. And it's very interesting to me that while the speeches and other words of Lincoln that I have read are filled with his humanity, his humor, his cares, his worries, even his strategies and his beliefs, all we have of Euclid is a cold, dry, abstract, and personalityless math book. So Lincoln didn't know Euclid very well at all. And yet, as we shall see, Lincoln speaks of his fondness for Euclid. And as we shall also see, what Lincoln is actually fond of is Euclid's reasoning process, or as Lincoln himself put it, Euclid's method of demonstration. And so by reading this cold, dry, abstract, personalityless math book, Lincoln meets Euclid. And he learns something from Euclid. And what he learns turns out to be something that he values very much and says so. Hence, his fondness for Euclid. That's Lincoln's own words. It is worth repeating, this demonstration process that Lincoln learns from reading Euclid is something he values very much. It is well documented that Lincoln carried a copy of Euclid in his saddlebag when he traveled the circuit court in Illinois. He refers to Euclid several times in his speeches, letters, and interviews, and I suspect that there are also many undocumented instances of Lincoln referring to Euclid in a positive way. Lincoln was one of many who valued Euclid in this way. So what exactly is this demonstration process that Lincoln so valued? One of my reasons for writing this book is to call attention to this once major, but now somewhat neglected concept in general education, that mathematics was once studied to understand axiomatic reasoning, also known as deductive reasoning, and then apply it to other disciplines. Axiomatic reasoning is the above-mentioned process that Lincoln valued. The geometry was secondary. It was the reasoning that was primary to Lincoln. I hope to make readers aware of this tremendously important part of Lincoln's education. I chose the title, When Lincoln Met Euclid, as a fun, catchy title, so to speak, but a more accurate title might be When Lincoln Discovered Axiomatic Reasoning by Reading Euclid's Elements. Learning axiomatic reasoning in this way was also an important part of the education of many great thinkers from the past, not just Lincoln. We will be looking at the words and thoughts of some of these folks with a particular emphasis on Alexander Hamilton and Albert Einstein. In fact, another possibility I had for the name of the book was Lincoln, Hamilton, and Einstein, almost as though they were a rock band like Crosby, Stills, and Nash or something. In fact, I thought of the cover having them all holding guitars. And I thought that that's interesting because how often do you think of the three of them together? Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, and Albert Einstein. But back to the book. We will be looking at the words and thoughts of some of these folks with a particular emphasis on Alexander Hamilton and Albert Einstein, their own uses of and endorsements of axiomatic reasoning. So let me start over. Their own uses of and endorsements of axiomatic reasoning, as well as their love of Euclid, is evident in their works. These thinkers advocated studying Euclid, meaning his geometry book, Elements, for reasons other than understanding circles and triangles. They, like Lincoln, believed in studying it to learn the reasoning process that Euclid used to develop an entire branch of knowledge. And importantly, they believed this process could be and should be applied to other disciplines. The geometry in Euclid's Elements is now referred to as Euclidean geometry, but previously it was simply called geometry because it was the only kind of geometry. I would like to take a moment here before we get into the meat of the discussion to say that personally, I wish that the word Euclidean referred to Euclid's approach to mathematics and his approach to reasoning rather than to the geometry itself. Because ultimately, it's Euclid's technique that is to be esteemed. That's what Lincoln esteemed, and Einstein and Hamilton too. Even what we now call non-Euclidean geometries are still developed using Euclid's technique as well as his writing style. So in this sense, they are actually more Euclidean than non-Euclidean. In fact, both the technique and the writing style of Euclid were used by the likes of Newton, Galileo, Spinoza, as well as Lincoln, Hamilton, Einstein, and many others. While Euclid did not invent axiomatic reasoning, he certainly showed its potential for developing complex ideas. More on this later. And so, throughout this book, when I use the word Euclid, or even when Lincoln is quoted using the word Euclid, it will often be a reference to axiomatic reasoning rather than a reference to the man Euclid or to the geometry. It may also be a reference to the book, Euclid's Elements, but even then, the reasoning process in the book rather than the geometry. I do have a purpose here beyond simply calling attention to this past emphasis on using math to study reasoning and proof. That is, I would like to make a case for the following. Teaching axiomatic reasoning should be a major role, if not the major role, of mathematics education within general education. That the once primary purpose of education in mathematics, that of teaching axiomatic reasoning, should be restored to its former status within the current general mathematics curriculum. When I say general mathematics curriculum, I mean the curriculum for all students, not just math science majors. In other words, it should be one of the general studies courses that all students take. And I will make the case that Lincoln would agree. And I will additionally make the cases that Albert Einstein and Alexander Hamilton and many more would also agree. Lincoln studied Euclid to become a lawyer, not to become a mathematician or a scientist. He applied it to his speech writing as a politician and his decision-making as president. Hamilton applied it in much the same way as Lincoln, and Einstein applied it not only to science, but to ethics and economics as well. I do believe, however, that nowadays, for various reasons which I hope to make clear in this book, it would be better to introduce axiomatic reasoning through arithmetic and algebra rather than through the geometry of Euclid. I hope that this will not cause confusion, because I will, on the one hand, constantly refer to the importance of studying Euclid, particularly for these famous people, and then on the other hand, advocate for a new treatment of the topic now, rather than actually using Euclid's elements. I believe that a study of Euclid would still be extremely valuable, but as a follow-up to studying the concepts of axiomatic reasoning through arithmetic and algebra. And after learning that there are several geometries now, not just the one presented in Euclid. Arithmetic is fundamental and universal and universally useful. Statements like 2 plus 3 equals 5 and A plus B equals B plus A are easily accepted truths worldwide. A new course in axiomatic reasoning through arithmetic can be and should be done in such a way that liberal arts students will truly enjoy studying it and find it meaningful and worthy of their time. I kind of messed that sentence up. I want to say it again. A new course in axiomatic reasoning through arithmetic can be found. A new course in axiomatic reasoning through arithmetic can be and should be done in such a way that liberal arts students will truly enjoy studying it and find it meaningful and worthy of their time, and in such a way that those who believe that they are not good at math need not fear. The study will be about learning the reasoning technique rather than gathering a bunch of math facts. Everybody uses axiomatic reasoning, at least informally. The aforementioned famous thinkers believed that studying axiomatic reasoning formally through the vehicle of mathematics helped them to reason better, to understand their own reasoning and thinking better, and to better understand the limits of human reasoning. It also helped them to, as Lincoln would put it, demonstrate for themselves the way they reasoned, and convince themselves, and hopefully others, of the soundness of their reasoning and the results. And while the very name of it, axiomatic reasoning, also sounds cold, dry, abstract, and personalityless, it's fun to consider how full of personality and passion most of these thinkers were as we look at their own passion for axiomatic thinking. A little bit on axioms here. Before we look at actual words of Lincoln himself, let me say a few things about axioms and the evolution of the term. Basically, both now and in earlier times, we say an axiom is a statement that is assumed to be true without proof. Mathematicians use axioms to prove new statements called theorems. Once a theorem has been proved by the axioms, that theorem is now a truth and can be used in proving more theorems. Since these theorems are all deduced from the original axioms, which are considered truths, these new theorems are then also considered truths. This is mostly correct at any point in the evolution of the word axiom. The word truths is in quotations to imply that it is still relative truth. It depends on one's acceptance of the axioms. It also depends on whether the initial axioms are themselves consistent with one another. I want to stress that an axiom is something that is assumed. I'll say that several times throughout this book. It can be helpful to even think of the two words, axiom and assumption, as synonyms. There's more to it than that, as we shall see, but an axiom is certainly, at the very least, an assumption. Prior to the 19th century, axioms were thought of as self-evident truths. Indeed, this was the phrase used in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration read, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Some historians claim that it was Benjamin Franklin who changed the wording to self-evident. Whether or not this is true, what is true is that both Jefferson and Franklin were admirers of Euclid. The change in wording supports the idea, as some have claimed, that the founders' desire to use a rational and axiomatic approach, the founders desired to use a rational and axiomatic approach in the document. In 1776, many, if not most, formally educated people would have studied geometry and likely used a translation of Euclid's Elements as a text. And they would have understood the Euclidean analogy used in the Declaration of Independence. We will look at an article of Alexander Hamilton's from the Federalist Papers, in which Hamilton makes the same assumption, that his readers have studied geometry and are familiar with Euclidean reasoning. Shortly after the American Revolution, a handful of mathematicians in Europe began developing geometries that were different from the geometry developed in Euclid's Elements. For centuries, mathematicians had wondered if a particular one of Euclid's axioms, the one often referred to as the parallel axiom, could actually be proved by the others. If it could, it would no longer be an axiom. It would be a theorem. It was the least self-evident of Euclid's axioms, and therefore there was a strong desire to prove it rather than just accept it without proof. No one was ever able to accomplish this. Eventually, some mathematicians played around with using alternative axioms in its place, axioms that denied its truth, expecting it to lead to contradictions. When it did not, they began to believe that alternative geometries could be developed. One of these men was the famous German mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. He never published his alternative geometry, but it is believed that he was the first to use the term non-Euclidean for these alternative geometries. And by calling these new geometries non-Euclidean, the original geometry that had been known for centuries simply as geometry eventually came to be called Euclidean geometry, since that was the geometry developed in Euclid's Elements. This is perfectly understandable, but as mentioned earlier, these non-Euclidean geometries were still developed by the Euclidean technique. And so I personally wish that the word Euclidean referred to the technique rather than to the geometry. But oh well, as they say. Although non-Euclidean geometries were already being investigated by Lincoln's time, very few people were aware of them, and the word geometry still referred to the geometry of Euclid's Elements. And axioms were still self-evident truths to Lincoln and most of his contemporaries. But by the end of the 19th century, and on into the 20th century, the meaning had changed to include any starting points for reasoning, even arbitrarily chosen ones. This was the case by the time Einstein was developing his relativity theories. For what it's worth, this is from Wikipedia about the meaning of the word axiom as of February 2018. The title has subtle differences, the term axiom has subtle differences in definition. I'm going to start that over. The term has subtle differences in definition when used in the context of different fields of study. As defined in classical philosophy, an axiom is a statement that is so self-evident or well established that it is accepted without controversy or question. As used in modern logic, an axiom is simply a premise or starting point for reasoning. And here's an informal, downright casual description of axiomatic reasoning that I may strike from the book, but I'm going to go ahead and read for you right now. You believe this one thing is true, and you believe this other thing is true. And from these things, you realize you must also believe this additional thing is true. And all of this leads you to the conclusion that you believe yet this fourth thing must also be true. And that coupled with one of the earlier items leads to yet another thing, and on and on. Non-Euclidean geometry was not the only reason that both the term axiom and the axiomatic method itself evolved into new meanings. In mathematics, the development of new number systems and new algebras, as well as the new geometries, occurred. In developing these systems and algebras, a set of statements could be made to essentially define the system itself. These statements were starting points and defined as truths of the system of ideas that were being developed. They were, therefore, statements which were accepted without proof, since they were arbitrarily chosen truths for the purpose of definition. These truths are axioms by the modern definition. Although they are not of the classic self-evident variety, they are still statements that are accepted without proof. That much of the definition is common to both the old and new meanings of the word axiom. An axiom is a statement that is assumed to be true without proof. Euclid's book begins with 23 definitions, followed by 5 postulates, as he called them, and 5 common notions. All of these could be considered axioms by the modern definition. They are also called first principles. The rest of his book is filled with propositions and the proofs of these propositions. In this context, a proposition is simply a statement that is to be proved true. Once a proposition has been proved, it becomes a theorem. Euclid uses the definitions, postulates, and common notions to prove the propositions. Lincoln would say to demonstrate the truth of the propositions. Again, this method of proof was not invented by Euclid, but he was the first that we know of to build a large body of abstract knowledge from the technique. He demonstrated that by recording in writing your first principles, or axioms, and then proving new propositions from them, and then recording in writing each new proposition proved, and then because you have recorded them and can easily refer to them, allowing yourself the use of the proved propositions whenever needed in subsequent proofs, that a huge list of more and more complex propositions can be proved to be true, so long as you believe in your first principles. The primary point of the extremely long previous sentence is that Euclid recorded in writing all of his axioms and theorems for use in future proofs. Because of this, he was able to demonstrate through a long chain of reasoning ever more complex results. This was Euclid's original and unique contribution to human knowledge, and it has been extremely valuable to mathematics. Lincoln, Einstein, and Hamilton, and many, many more have found it extremely valuable in other areas as well. I have a hope that this book will encourage readers to read more about Lincoln. I want to say that again with different emphasis. I have a hope that this book will encourage readers to read more about Lincoln. He was a remarkable man, and everyone should get to know him, and get to know him well. I will include a list of recommended books in the last chapter. And of course, Einstein and Hamilton are worth meeting as well. End of chapter 1. Thank you.